today's video, we are going to be talking about 10 reasons why I am thankful that my husband is the leader of the home and that I'm not the leader of the home.
If that's what you actually want, more power to you, but there's lots of couples who don't want that. Most couples do best in an egalitarian type of marriage. Not everything's split 50-50, but the two are equal partners. And this isn't even getting into same-sex couples, which don't even fit the heteronormative idea of a couple. But I have a feeling I don't want to know what you think about LGBTQ plus people, so that's all I'll say about that for now.
So I thought this would be a fun video because I feel like in today's culture, the cultural mindset and even progressive kind of Christianity mindset is that men aren't really respected or encouraged to be put in the leadership role.
What planet are you living on? Men are the leaders in almost every facet of society, and you don't have to be the one commanding the ship to be respected.
I love having my husband in the leadership role personally, and I do believe that that's what the Bible puts and calls men to, and wives are called to be submissive to their husbands.
Yeah, but the Bible also says that women are inherently unclean just because Eve wanted to gain the knowledge about good and evil. A curious mind is treated as a bad thing. The Bible even says that a woman who gives birth to a girl is unclean twice as long if she had given birth to a boy.
And allow their husbands to grow in that leadership role. Now, that doesn't mean that the husband should overrule their wives at all.
We're just over 2 minutes in, and we already have our first contradiction. How can you sit there and say that husbands shouldn't overrule their wives, when in the previous sentence, you said that wives are called to be submissive to their husbands, and that they should allow their husbands to grow into that relationship? In what way does what you're describing not sound like an abusive relationship?
The husbands have a high calling. And in Ephesians 5, it talks to the wives and husbands. I think it's Ephesians 5, it might be Ephesians 4.
No, you were right the first time. It was from Ephesians 5. One of many verses within the Bible that shows just how sexist the Bible really is. While there are some good verses in there about loving thy neighbor and helping the poor, there's also verses that should be left in the sands of time, such as any verse pertaining to slavery, stoning disobedient children, the rampant homophobia, or, when it comes to women, verses that advocate women be submissive, and the verses that suggest rape victims should marry their rapists.
They have a high calling to respect us. It doesn't mean that they should be walking over us, but as wives, we are called to respect our husbands and accept the headship and authority that God has given him.
That sounds like a recipe for unhappiness brewing throughout a marriage. How do you know your husband wouldn't abuse his power and use his role as the family patriarch to get whatever he wants? A situation that is fairly common in traditional Christian relationships. For the record, I'm not saying that domestic abuse doesn't happen in secular or left-wing relationships, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be called out when it happens. It absolutely should. Nor am I saying that there aren't healthy relationships where both partners believe in a religion. I'm just saying that domestic abuse is far more common in relationships that depend more on traditional values.
So the first reason why I love that my husband is the leader of the home and the provider of our home is it gives me and our growing family, for those of you who don't know, we are expecting our first baby in the very beginning of April. So it gives me and our growing family security. I know that with him being a provider, we aren't going to go hungry, and there's no stress of the income and financials, so much so on my part. Any stress that I might have towards financials here and there is usually wrongly placed because it's not something that needs to be put on my shoulders. It's a weight that's on his shoulders.
But if you ever want to pursue a passion and you can't, how do you know that won't lead to some deep resentment? Like even YouTube, for example. What if he decides that it's unchristian of you to make YouTube videos and decides your channel's gotta go?
The second reason that I like that my husband is the leader of our home is it's attractive.
How? How is a husband who makes almost every decision for you attractive in the slightest?
I think it's like the most attractive thing ever when your husband steps up and wants to provide and protect your family. I think that is an amazing quality, and I love that he wants to be the protector and provider for me. I just think it is super sexy, honestly. I definitely am not attracted to someone who is more passive and laid back and just unmotivated.
False dichotomy. Someone can be hardworking without taking up a leadership role. There are lots of relationships where men and women both share the responsibilities. In fact, a relationship where both discuss an idea requires both to take a more active role instead of a simple, man makes a declaration, that's the end of that.
I think his motivation to provide for our family and want to do all that he can to put us in a good financial circumstance, to protect us, our safety, any of those just kind of leadership qualities of being the head of the household, making final decisions for what he thinks is best for our family, any of those kind of things, it comes from a protective heart. And I just think that's really attractive.
What about a man who still wants to provide and care for his family even when he's not the head of the household? Someone wanting to be around and feel needed shouldn't be dependent on whatever leadership role they may or may not have.
The third reason why I'm happy my husband is the leader of our home is he desires to be more Christ-like, and he tries to lead our family closer to God.
Not everyone believes Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior. For example, I don't. But, hypothetically speaking, let's say I did. Let's say I was a Christian and eventually got married. Honoring God in my relationship would be the last thing that would be on my mind. I'd rather focus more on strengthening my relationship with my partner rather than I would trying to bring our relationship closer to a deity that may or may not exist.
The fourth reason is my husband has a servant's heart. Not only does he serve me and our family, but he loves to serve others around him. He just has a really good and strong character and really wants to pour into other people, help other people without expecting anything in return.
She's making her husband sound like this really cool anarchist who likes to spend his time volunteering at Food Not Bombs. But when you look at her Twitter feed and sees that she retweets content from conservative pundits, Trump included, you can see that that isn't anywhere close to the truth.
So I think that that is just really good, genuine character that really shows that you can trust someone and they are really having your best intentions and just wanting to help you and not wanting control or any of those kind of things, but they are just serving you.
So it sounds like you're saying you want to be controlled but not be so obvious about it. Sounds more like gaslighting than a healthy marriage.
The fifth reason why I'm happy that my husband is the leader of the home is because his decision making is less emotionally influenced than mine would be.
This is the patriarchal view that men are more likely to think logically, whereas women tend to think with their emotions. It's a view that's been ingrained in our society for ages and isn't anywhere close to the truth, especially when you factor in that many conservative men voted for Trump in the 2016 election based on their emotions and their feelings alone. Contrary to popular belief, anger is an emotion, and a mighty dangerous one when placed in the hands of far-right fascists.
The sixth reason is he values my role as a homemaker, mother, and wife, and he doesn't think that I need to be accomplishing more than those things to bring value to our relationship.
Before we go any further, this is the part of the video where the subtle hints that our marriage is less perfect than what she's telling us comes to the forefront. I'm talking possible Lifetime movie of the week material. The part of the video where it seems like basing your relationship off values you pulled out of Hallmark movies might be a terrible idea. Hang on.
He thinks my role at home is insanely valuable, and there have actually been times when I was transitioning into this role where financially we needed a little bit more money, and he was in the process of trying to make that happen for us. And this goes back to my whole fearful decision making kind of ways. I, a while ago, this was probably 9 or so months ago, was looking into getting a part-time job outside of the home to help our financial situation. But he was like, hey, I really value that you have been at home and making that a priority. I think it's really helping me get my drive for work and really motivating me to be more of a provider. I want you to stay home. I don't want you to take this job.
Right there. Amanda wanted to find a job to get some additional money to support her family, and her husband's response basically amounted to, no, I prefer it if you remained a subservient doormat to follow my every whim. How are you going to sit there and tell me that that isn't emotional abuse. You can only convince yourself that things are okay when they're not for so long before somewhere down the road, major problems emerge. And this is a fairly common trend within the trad wife community. Women giving up their careers because their husbands disapprove of their decisions. Like I mentioned, I have no problem with women staying at home to take care of their children if it's their choice. But if your husband is trying to prevent you from having a job to make some extra money to support your family, then it becomes a problem.
He really values my role as a wife and mother, and he doesn't want me to be outside of the home. He thinks it is the most valuable place that I have, that I can be. It's helping him grow, and we're a team unit.
If one person is in charge of the other person in a relationship, that's not a team. That's a hierarchy.
The seventh reason why I'm happy my husband is the leader of our home is because he respects me and my opinions. He totally values me, like I was saying before, and he wants my input when he's making decisions that are going to affect our family.
Once again, this contradicts everything you said in the previous point. In the last point, you described how your husband doesn't want you to be outside the home and how he doesn't want you to get a job. You can't have a relationship built on respect if your partner is controlling every aspect of your life.
Reason number 8 is that he's very self-aware of his strengths and weaknesses, and he puts me in charge of the things that he knows that he's not good at. So he is not trying to run the ship all by himself.
Are you quite certain about that? Because it sure does seem that way based on how he prefers to have you confined to the home and how he doesn't want you to look for work.
He does have a headship, but that doesn't mean that he can't divvy up some of his responsibilities and tasks on to me. So for our financials, as an example, he knows that I tend to be just a little bit better with practical number stuff than he is. So I'm in charge of kind of laying out a foundation of a budget and kind of putting that in his direction. And that doesn't mean that he's going to 100% follow it to a T.
Okay, the contradictions are starting to give me a headache. In the very first point, you mentioned how you wouldn't have to worry about financial stress because your husband would handle everything. And yet, in this point, you mentioned how you're in charge of creating a budget to prevent him from overspending. It makes it seem like you do have stress about your financial situation after all.
So reason number 9 is he values relationships and encourages us to prioritize community. And I really, really love and respect this because I know that sometimes people like to isolate themselves, especially in marriage, and it gets super lonely. But he knows the value of having a community and just being open with other people. Especially if you're having any marital issues, having an older couple that you look up to that can pour into you and lead you closer together and closer to God is so important. And just community has been one of the best things for our relationship with God and our relationship with each other.
The thing is, you can be community-minded without having to bring others closer to God. You can also be community-minded without being a domineering alpha male who loves to be the leader of the relationship. I think most of us would prefer it that way, as I highly doubt organizations like Food Not Bombs would approve of domineering alpha males who love to control every aspect of their relationship.
So the 10th and final reason that I'm sharing with you guys today of why I love that my husband is the leader of our home is that he values time with family. He doesn't desire to get away from our family. He is not someone that feels like he needs to be out with guys all the time. He's not trying to be a child. He is totally immersed in his role of being a provider and a leader of our home, and he doesn't try to get away. So every once in a while, he will go pursue some hobbies and fun time with his guy friends, but it is not something that is taking up more time than we spend on a one-on-one basis for date nights, or that he spends at home and just pouring in valuable time with the family. So I super appreciate that he has a desire to be home and focus and prioritize our family before his fun time, or like being home is fun for him and enjoyable.
I'm probably the worst person to comment on this, as I'm a 26-year-old man who's never been in a relationship, but based on how you described your relationship, I think the reason he doesn't try to get away is less because he cares about you and more to make sure you're following his every whim down to the letter. Granted, this video came out in January, and as far as I can tell 9 months later, her relationship could be a genuinely loving and healthy one, but based on how she described her relationship, it's safe for me to assume that there's emotional abuse and gaslighting taking place behind the scenes.
Let's just lift up the men in our lives for pursuing their God-given biblical roles and doing a job that is honestly really hard, and I'm happy it's not on my shoulders personally, but I think that they deserve some encouragement and words of affirmation for all that they do for us. So I so appreciate my husband and all that he does for our family. So that's why I wanted to make today's video, just to lift up my husband personally, but also to encourage women to be lifting up your husbands and being thankful for all that they do for your family if they're the leader of your home or striving to grow into that role.
Once again, if lifting your husband up is something you want to do personally, then more power to you. However, given this is something you want women in general to be doing, the fact that you want women to be subservient doormats to their husbands, even if they don't want to, that's what makes tradwives far more dangerous than the innocent facade they display on camera.
There's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for them. Most men, unfortunately, aren't encouraged or raised up to be the leaders of their homes nowadays.
Again, what planet are you living on? Like I mentioned earlier, men have always been encouraged to be the leader.
So let's add some encouragement and make this like a positive thing. A man being the leader of the home is awesome. I love that, and I think it's something to be honored and admired and not something that they should be shamed for desiring or doing.
If anyone's curious as to why relationships shouldn't be based on values pulled out of Hallmark movies, this video plays a role as to why. Minus the 1950s aesthetic, this video highlights everything wrong about the tradwife community. I don't even know whether I should feel sorry for her because of the potential emotional abuse that these kind of relationships help fester, or if I should feel appalled given the far-right conservative talking points she believes. And the contradictions found throughout this video are just mind-numbing. As such, this will probably be the only tradwife video I'll respond to because what else can I bring to the table regarding this community? What else can I say about Girl Defined or Mrs. Midwest or classically Abby that hasn't been already said by everyone else? There isn't anything else I can add. Even still, I want to express my disgust for the far-right fascist values this community endorses, while also responding to one of the lesser-known voices featured in this community.
So, after many of you have speculated about my stance on race, especially my recent one, I've decided to make a video about it. Because heck, I love talking about things that will probably get me kicked off YouTube and every other social media website.
Prophetic words. We already knew your stance on race, and now you're just being more honest about it. But you did accurately predict, even jokingly, you'd push things too far. Glad to see that your repugnant, loathsome views and self-righteous crusade against people of color has finally caught up to you. It's hilarious how a little backlash causes alt-right snowflakes to melt.
Racism, it's an interesting lexeme. I remember being first taught about it when I was a wee little kid, and we were talking about the slave trade, you know, in Africa and all that other shit. So at the time, I only saw racism as a thing that white people did to black people. Despite the fact that I as a kid was racially profiled for being German, for example, I got called a Nazi on the playground, etc., I never actually assumed that that was a case of racism. I just thought, heck, that's just people being assholes, right?
And little you was right. It wasn't racism. At most, it was prejudice and discrimination. You're a perfect example of how inchoate ideas can be malformed by alt-right propaganda, peddled by charlatans looking for a quick buck, and you served as the perfect customer, happily gobbling up their lies. But I have my doubts about the authenticity of the story. You grew up in Germany, and you were called a Nazi in your own country as a common occurrence? I call bullshit.
Which leads me to think, despite having known what racism was, I still wasn't able to put A and B together. Which then gives me another question to whether or not the term racism actually properly exists. Racism is a made-up word. Well, heck, every word is a made-up word.
Wow. Not even going for the racism against white people approach that Brittany Pettibone went for. Just going for the no such thing as racism. What next? Are you going to try and justify treating other people like shit?
We use words to explain new things that we describe to often make our lives a heck of a lot easier. And then we use those words to accuse people of things to help our own selfish narrative of getting our point across.
You know how there's this prevalent stereotype of anti-SJWs not giving a fuck about anyone but themselves and their own myopic worldview? You're one of the truest examples of that stereotype I've seen.
The same goes with transphobia, Islamophobia, and many other words that are used for fearmongering. And words like these all lie under the same hood. They are used to force force people to ignore why we might feel uneasy about people that look or are a little bit different. And notice how these words were mostly created by minorities or people who felt oppressed. These words gave people power that would inevitably cause other people a retraction of rights.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
For example, when we speak of racism, the overuse of the word has allowed affirmative action to be implemented in our society. Or when we use the word sexism, the use of that word has allowed women to gain more custody rights, despite the fact that they probably have been terrible mothers or triggered a divorce for no reason.
What? You actually believe that affirmative action is because of what you anti-SJWs define as overusing the word racist? It couldn't possibly have anything to do with the fact that people of color are more likely to be discriminated against, can it? No, it's obviously because someone got called a racist when they felt it wasn't deserved. And you think women getting preferential treatment in custody battles is a new thing? No, it's not because of feminism. It's because of the traditionalism you love so much. You just used a men's rights talking point while supporting a mindset that many men's rights activists say they're not a fan of. So let me get this straight. Women shouldn't get preferential custody treatment, but they should because they are more nurturing.
Do you even listen to yourself when you talk? I drift in and out.
Obviously, I wouldn't deny that any type of racism is still prevalent in our society, but that's not really my point. My point is, why do we need to use the word racism to describe the development of African or some Middle Eastern countries?
Because that's exactly what caused the colonialism that led to the poor development of these countries over the past couple of centuries, and their continued struggles. The white man pillaged the resources and subjugated, if not genocided, the people, and now has the gall to wonder why things are tough in those countries.
Let's look at the continent of Africa, for example.
Interesting that you mentioned the Middle East before, but are now shying away from it because you know every reliable source down to a history book for grade schoolers would state that India and the Middle East were civilized nations just a few centuries ago, and it was the white Europeans who were the barbarian invaders. The scientific developments that most of Europe left behind in the Dark Ages were being continued in the land of people you fear the most.
What we're told as wee little youngsters is that the white man has caused every single issue that exists in Africa, and that we are the reason that they are not developed. Could you believe it? Some people actually still think that Africa would look like this if the white man wouldn't have interfered.
Nobody says that the white man is the sole cause for these problems, but it's undeniable what kinds of effects colonialism has had. It took different ethnic groups and divided them among arbitrary lines into white man-created nations, forcing groups to live together that have a long history of conflict while dividing the groups themselves. Let's not forget how many resources that Europeans have pillaged from these places. Look at the pyramids in Egypt, for example. Countless goods stolen. Once again, look at the effects being a conquered nation had on other countries, even in Europe. Poland and many other Eastern European nations have long been subjected to this, and some are still categorized as developing nations to this date. It did not truly industrialize until well into the 20th century.
But what we weren't told as wee little youngsters is that Africans were enslaving, killing, and raping people long before the white man arrived.
And Europeans were doing this to each other for millennia, and sub-Saharan Africans have been traded in the slave trade route dating back to antiquity. What's your point?
Despite the aggression probably increasing due to slavery, the white man still did a lot of good things for Africa. Fun story. During the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans could not penetrate into Africa for very long or very far due to the threat of malaria and other tropical diseases. The sailing ships were on a timetable to catch the best winds for the year. They would buy their slaves from blacks on offshore islands. Then they took off before the hurricane season. Blacks were completely complicit in the slave trade and actually benefited from it.
More right-wing Tea Party propaganda. While there was some slave trade by Africans selling other Africans, the overwhelming majority of it involved capturing free blacks. And even if we granted the white nationalist bullshit narrative is true, it would still stand to reason that a vast majority of black people did not benefit from this. The instances where this actually happened are not an indictment of people with more melanin in their skin, but of capitalism.
For the Americans and Europeans' involvement in it, the slave trade would have not occurred without the black people's permission, including their involvement and approval. Besides, we do forget that it was whites who largely ended slavery.
Do you even do research? Seriously, do you? Sorry, but Rent and Daily Stormer don't count. I know you backpedaled and claimed just a joke, bro, with a Stormfront news site, but you're clearly reading off cue cards here. Do you really believe that Africans would not have been captured if not for permission from warlords? What do you think happened with the enslaved Native Americans? As for your claim of it being whites who largely ended the slave trade, they wouldn't have ended it had enslaved Africans not gotten involved with the abolition. And if you don't believe me, in the description of this video, you will find a PDF link to Equiano's autobiography. It helped play a role in the abolition of the slave trade in 1807.
Another fun fact. Arab slave traders had actually enslaved more people than the European slave traders did. Blacks had rounded up one another and sold each other to the Arab slave traders too. Not to mention, us Europeans were also enslaved by the Arabs.
Europeans were the ones who made a large industry out of slavery, and the effects of this are still being felt. As I had previously elucidated to Brittany Pettibone, there are people alive today who knew people that were slaves.
Where's our affirmative action? Oh right, white people are fucking terrible, I forgot.
Do white nationalists ever stop playing the victim long enough to realize that maybe, just maybe, the ridiculous things you say born from your propaganda mills might be completely not based in any reality outside of your little bubble? I would ask you to use your gray matter, except you've made it abundantly clear that in between your ears lies not gray matter, but brown matter, which has had the effect of redirecting the source of your speech to the origin of said brown matter. And the pungent aroma of your propaganda wafts all over the internet, with its disgusting stench being inflicted upon anyone unfortunate enough to discover it.
Even though it was the British Empire that first abolished the slave trade, losing a heck of a lot of money and lives in the process, but okay. White men! But white men people still ruined Africa! Actually, when the European Empire stepped away from Africa, Africa practically went down the shitter.
Sure, let's give Europeans credit for leaving the room after making such a mess of everything. A child tears up the wallpaper, smashes the windows, breaks all the toys, rips open the pillow, busts the ceiling light, pees all over the carpet, breaks the lamp, and jumps on the bed until the frame collapses, and now you want to reward it for leaving the room when it could have done more damage? I take it you know nothing about the Kingdom of Nigeria from the 16th century, which had nothing to do with European whites as it was before colonialism, or the empires of Kush or Aksum. You're probably going to claim they were blonde, blue-eyed Nordics that founded them, right? Perhaps the reason you fear immigration so much is that you're on some level aware of the white man's sordid history, and fear the same thing will be done to white people that white people did to others. I assure you, that's not the case.
I mean, who did they elect in their first democratic election? Surely they must have elected someone who liberated the country and proved many rights for blacks. No. Zimbabweans managed to elect a genocidal cockbag, aka Robert Mugabe. I mean, if that's not a case of extreme racism, then what does the word racism even mean?
And white nations never elected national embarrassments before. Oh, wait.
Let us delve into the crime rate of America.
And here comes the part of the video that makes this video the vile, festering pile of rancid garbage that sets it apart from run-of-the-mill right-wing stupidity like the previous videos I've covered so far, and pushes it in the direction of blatant Nazi propaganda. And please spare me that you call everyone you disagree with a Nazi that I know a lot of the alt-right likes to employ. You don't get to compare feminists to Nazis and complain that the word is being diluted.
Feminism. Now, the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men.
Nazi. A member of the National Socialist German Workers' Union.
About 13% of Americans are black, according to the estimates from the US Census Bureau. And yes, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, black offenders committed 52% of homicides. This was in data recorded between 1980 and 2008. Only 45% of the offenders were white. In 2013, the FBI reported that 38% of murders were committed by blacks. However, only 31.1% were committed by whites. In 29.1% of cases, the perpetrator's race was unknown. Over 3 years of data from 2011 to 2013, 38.5% of people arrested for murder, robbery, manslaughter, rape, and aggravated assault were black. This is evidence from official police reports that blacks are more likely to commit crimes than whites. And why is this? Is it the unfair justice system?
And society's unfair treatment of people of color on a conscious and subconscious level. Non-whites are more likely to live in densely packed urban areas, but any highly urbanized area will have a higher crime rate regardless of its demographics. Look at Wheeling, West Virginia, for example, a majority white city with a high crime rate. Boise, Idaho is another example, but has almost 1.5 times the crime rate as the rest of Idaho. Madison, Wisconsin is another example. I know that the exceptions don't prove the rule, but the point is, many large cities happen to have a very large African American population.
You guys like to say that, but it's not. In the book of IQ and the Wealth of Nations, it talks about the IQ of the average sub-Saharan African being at 80. The IQ of an African American is normally at 85. White populations in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Europe, South Africa, and the United States score really close to one another, being at around 100. The reason to why IQ is such an important factor is because a lower IQ causes many detrimental factors in society. These include poverty, dropping out of school, unemployment, divorce and lower rates of marriage, welfare dependency, a child's poor motor skills and development, and criminal behavior. So then, setting out these societal differences, which is backed by data, surely should be common sense, right? Think again, we are still expected to act as if these IQ differences do not exist at all.
And what do you think affects IQ? It's not an unbiased measure of intelligence or one's potential intelligence, but a factor of how well one is able to solve logic puzzles and regurgitate facts. If one's interest is nurtured, they will be more likely to succeed. The answer, of course, to what variables play a role in IQ is environmental factors. West Virginia has a lower IQ on average than the rest of the United States, for example, ranking it at 46th. Meanwhile, New Jersey, an ethnically diverse state, has the second highest national IQ average. Also, it should be worth noting that the authors of the book and their follow-up even admit that environment does play a factor, but the work has received a lot of criticism for incomplete data and the fact that it can be used to push for national policies.
Thus assuming that the societal problems occurring are not a genetic factor, but are blamed on white people as per usual. And if we highlight these slight differences, we are called racist and assholes. However, it is a fact that wherever black people are concentrated in large numbers in the West, they are likely to promote tribal situations, such as gangs, territories, and fights. But for some reason, it is still our fault as white people.
Because the Mafia, Irish street gangs like the Dead Rabbits, nativist wasp street gangs like the Bowery Boys, and motorcycle gangs don't exist, right? Or are you going to claim that Italians and Irish aren't really white? Or how about the Greaser street gangs of the 50s, which were mostly white? But that still leaves the aforementioned gangs and the Ku Klux Klan, who I'm sure you're quite fond of. And over in England in the 50s, there were the Teddy Boys, which in the 60s became mods and rockers. And if you want to talk tribalism, how about how many US cities were sharply divided among ethnic lines between Irish, German, English, Polish, Jewish, Italian, and many other groups until as recently as the 1960s in many places.
On average, densely populated black communities show a thirst for tribal mentality, as well as tribal warfare, because it is still white people to blame for a problem that is predominantly genetic.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Whites have given many resources to help black communities in the West and even in Africa. However, black communities on average remain unsuccessful in full integrations in civilized communities.
And of course you think that's genetic. You don't think it could possibly have anything to do with the fact that racist white assholes like yourself continue to other them and act uncomfortable at the idea of living around black people.
It might also be surprising that blacks have a higher self-esteem than whites on average. In one large study of 11 to 16-year-olds, blacks rated themselves as more attractive than did whites. Blacks also rated themselves higher in reading, social studies, and sciences, but funnily enough, not in mathematics.
What does having a higher self-esteem have to do with skin color? If it has anything to do with race, it's because it's a reaction to being told by society that black people aren't as good at intellectual pursuits and less like the white standard of beauty seen in Western movies. The more you remove the idea of one race being the gold standard or any expectations of failure, the better everyone does. But it's just a start. We of course need to address the environmental factors that go into it. Factors you like to pretend don't exist. Speaking of DNA, did you know that sub-Saharan Y chromosome DNA has been found in the majority of British people dating back to the Roman times? Yet, the sun never set on the British Empire at one time, and it led the world for a few centuries when it came to industry and military technology. Not bad for a nation that has DNA you deem incapable of creating great things.
This inferiority complex leads to the whole "we was kings and shit" debacle.
Fuck off with that racist bullshit, you bigoted piece of shit.
A lot of black people like to assume that they were Egyptian kings, which is funny because it doesn't help the whole slave thing. But nonetheless, they really weren't kings. Near to every single African slave that was brought from Africa to America came from mainly two countries in Africa, Senegambia and Angola. Both of these countries are on the west coast of Africa, and neither of these countries are anywhere near to Egypt.
Do you really believe that all African Americans are Hoteps? Despite what your brainwashing tells you, despite the fact that Egypt wasn't a sub-Saharan African country, there was no Nordic desert empire. It was not ruled by people with blonde hair and blue eyes.
Mitochondrial DNA proves this. Not to mention, a lot of African languages prove that black people lack abstract thinking. As I would like to mention, not all black people lack it. As I said, this is just an average. The English to Zulu language dictionary has only 250 pages. And like the other African Negro languages, it does not include a working definition of any abstract concepts.
Your own source for this, a white supremacist blog that clearly wouldn't have an agenda to push. No, these digital sophists aren't promoting some kind of ridiculous agenda at all. Second Clancy does a great job of showing how your own source contradicted itself. Overall, it's a good video if you can look past the ideological axe to grind against SJWs, which these guys are contractually obligated to provide in every video. But I would like to add this. If you've ever seen African art, or African American art, or heard some of the musical innovations that black people have come up with, you would see just how weak and flimsy the black people can't do abstract thinking argument is. At this point, this video has gone so far beyond merely being a garden variety cacophony of preposterous, racist, unenlightened, fear-mongering bullshit, to something that seems designed to be as offensive as possible, merely for the sake of seeing how horrible the lurid, unhinged, detestable ramblings of a racist little shit who's addicted to outrage can possibly be. Congratulations! You've approached Stormfront levels of disingenuous ramblings that has disgusted your own community so much that even the Kekistani frogs want nothing to do with you anymore. I'm sure you'll still have your loyal fan base, who fantasize about cheating on their anime body pillows with you. But the people who thought you were just a garden variety anti-SJW can no longer deny the truth, that you are an ignoramus with a penchant for bigotry, an addiction to outrage. Hence why you jumped from Tumblr straight to Stormfront. Although your "I used to be an SJW" could have meant that you were previously a liberal shitlord like Shiwan Head, someone you likely consider an SJW.
Because technically, it's not possible for them to think that way or those communities to have been thinking that way. Obviously, you can then argue why a lot of African Americans are then able to learn English. However, do you remember when I said that the average African American IQ is 15 points higher than that of the sub-Saharan Africans? That could be a reason why.
Or it could be that Western IQ tests are geared towards Westerners, and the fact that environmental conditions in the US are better than the war-torn nations that the poor oppressed white people subjugated and pillaged for centuries. In a few centuries, it's certainly possible that some, or all African nations, will pull far ahead of Europe and the Americas, and there will be some who say that Europeans having a lower IQ is because of white genetic inferiority. Of course, this is just one of many possibilities.
So again, whenever I'm talking about this, it's really important to remember that I am talking about an average. Anyway, that's enough from me.
Of all the videos I've responded to, this festering pile of dog shit is perhaps the worst. It's even worse than those undoomed videos I responded to last year. RageAfterStorm is one of the few anti-SJWs which I can honestly say has no redeeming characteristics whatsoever. She has failed to demonstrate that she has any kind of standards beyond what happens to her personally. She's a lot like Edgy Sphinx, a racist piece of human garbage that infiltrated the skeptic community by making anti-SJW videos before pushing alt-right propaganda. It seems that the skeptic community is finally starting to get it. Edgy wasn't an anomaly. When they focus entirely on bashing feminism and social justice, they shouldn't be surprised to find some of the people that they share their views on feminism and social justice are going to be anti a whole lot of other things. Rather than stand up to the alt-right, these guys have treated them like allies, or not much of a threat, showing they fear Anita Sarkeesian much more than Richard Spencer, and their focus on bashing feminism allows these guys to sneak in alt-right propaganda. It's only when it becomes so obvious that it can't be ignored that the skeptic community finally admits that it's not just SJWs calling everyone Nazi. Just because they agree with Nazis on feminism and social justice doesn't mean they should buddy up with them. Forget your stupid culture war. Outside of YouTube, who really cares that some random cartoon animal made a response to some video to some random teenage girl with 80 subscribers?
Hey, this is Roaming Millennial. Welcome back to my channel. Today, let's talk about oppression. And special announcement, just so you guys know, I am now selling merchandise.
Of course they're selling merchandise. Gotta capitalize on right-wingers' desires to make ridiculous ideas a trend. Bearing you stolen artwork, Paul Soy Boy Joseph Watson sells Brain Force, contains soy, and in another video, you're selling magic tea.
So in my last video, I covered the student protests at Evergreen College, and like a lot of you guys, I think, watching the footage of the students protesting and hearing how strong their victimhood mentalities were really irked me, to say the least.
Kind of funny how people standing up for their rights is often derided as being a victim by the right, while suffering in silence is strength. Also funny how conservatives are whining about being silenced on YouTube and Twitter by being demonetized or losing their blue checkmark.
And as frustrating as it might be hearing students complain about being oppressed at a liberal arts college in the United States, the sad fact of the matter is that these kids are probably just parroting what they've been told their entire lives. The idea that non-white people, or people of color, if you will, are being systematically marginalized by our society is a narrative that's been pushed by social justice advocates for decades.
Maybe because it's true? Ever think about that? Yes. Things have gotten better, but when you're assembling a 500-piece puzzle, do you stop after assembling 300 pieces and decide it's good enough? Nope. Imagine if a football team had the ball, trying to score the game-winning field goal in overtime, then suddenly just squatted on the ball deciding a tie game's good enough for me, which is probably what you want those football players to do, since you and many other masturbators spent months giving Colin Kaepernick hell for kneeling during the national anthem.
It's an idea that's been propagated by leftist academics, quote-unquote journalists, and especially increasingly in popular culture. As repugnant as I find the behavior of the Evergreen College students, it's really not all that surprising that they think the way they do, having grown up in this kind of environment. So in this video, in the hopes of healing this headache of imaginary oppression that is going around the social justice sphere,
poisoning the well already, calling it imaginary oppression. Because as we know, if it doesn't exactly resemble the horrifying images from our history books, it's not real racism, right?
We're going to be talking all about oppression, what it means to be oppressed, and how in the United States and in the rest of the Western world, no, people of color, you are not oppressed. So to start, let's go over the definition of oppression. And yes, I know this is super basic, but after hearing those students protest, I really do feel that cracking a dictionary open is necessary.
Yet when a feminist uses the dictionary definition, your side gives her hell for it.
So the definition of oppression is really quite simply prolonged cruel or unjust treatment or control. Now with this definition, I think it is perfectly clear to say that in the past, people of color, and more specifically African American people, were oppressed by societies in the United States and the West in general. I'm not going to argue against that.
Here comes the big but.
However, the issue here is that these Evergreen students and so many social justice warriors out there are not just arguing for the idea of past oppression, but for current and ongoing oppression.
Yes.
And really, that is just a completely inaccurate analysis of the world that we live in. Obviously, in the United States, there are no legal rights that a white person possesses that a non-white person does not, and there are no laws on the books that reference an individual's race in any way.
As we all know, laws make racism magically go away, right? Do you know what Jim Crow was called back in the day? Separate but equal. The claim that segregation guaranteed equal access and equal facilities for African Americans. The reality was nothing like that, however. Are things better than they were in the Jim Crow days? Absolutely. Is racism over? Absolutely not.
Right? I mean, our legal system, our entire system of government is not one that is racially coded. And while, in my opinion, equal standing in the eyes of the law and equal standing before government is a pretty clear indication that oppression is not happening, some critics might say, no, what are you talking about? There's no equal standing. There are huge racial disparities when it comes to the legal system, especially the criminal justice system. Just look at how much more likely black people are to be incarcerated than Hispanic or white people. I mean, obviously that's the result of oppression.
And we're about to hear the standard Republican talking points why it's not, aren't we?
So for oppression to be happening, black people would need to be incarcerated unjustly at a higher rate than other races, right? Because it wouldn't be oppression if these people were being justly arrested and prosecuted for crimes that they actually did commit.
Yep, that's why a mom who happened to be African American was arrested for leaving her daughter unattended in the food court while she was 20 feet away at a job interview, and why so many black people are given ridiculous sentences for smoking and selling weed, right? That's also why George Zimmerman got off scot-free after killing Trayvon Martin, right? Because according to anti-SJWs, he was this vicious thug and Zimmerman was just doing his job, when even knowing the very basics about the case will tell you that's horseshit. And that's why Brock Turner only got a 6-month sentence that was further reduced to 3 for violently raping a woman and was said to be a kid with a bright future. Or how about the black kid shot to death for using a fucking squirt gun. Even more centrist types admit that was blatant racism. And the recent school shooting where they arrested the killer alive, who happened to be white. So, why the sympathy for the white kid by a lot of people, and the lack of sympathy for the black kid? I'm barely cracking the surface.
So while many social justice activists try to paint the large black prison populations in the US as evidence of oppression, the fact is that black people are more likely to commit crimes than other races. So with this being the case, it is not unjust and therefore not oppressive for the racial makeup of prison populations to be representative of the racial makeup of people who commit crimes.
It's a mix of poor people in urban areas commit more crimes, black people in urban areas are more likely to be poor for various reasons, and societal prejudice and harsher sentences keep them in poverty, while conservatives proclaiming racism is over, pull yourself out of poverty, well, they're more likely to be arrested and given harsher sentences.
The question here isn't, are there proportionately more black people in prison than white people, because obviously that's the case. The question is why? Is it because prejudice causes more black people than white people to be convicted of crimes that they did not commit? Or is it because on average a black person is more likely to commit a crime than a white person and therefore more likely to go to jail for what they've done? Statistics would indicate the latter.
Did you know that crime statistics are based on those who are arrested? And it's not just simple as black people commit more crimes.
If we take a look at the most dangerous cities in the United States, we see that in general the African American populations of these cities are much higher than the national average.
If we look at cities in general, the African American population is higher than the national average. I know where you're going with this.
And I'm not bringing this up to go all race realist on you guys, but regardless of who's being charged for these crimes, wrongfully or not, areas that have large or concentrated African American populations also tend to correlate very strongly with areas that have high rates of reported violent crimes.
Correlation does not equal causation. No matter how many times you want to say, I'm not a racist, I'm not. It's clear you were saying that black people are more crime prone. But let's take a look at a few select cities. Dothan, Alabama is around 2/3 African American, but has one of the lowest crime rates in Alabama, and is very close to the national average. Wheeling, West Virginia is 91% white, but has a high crime rate. Altoona, Pennsylvania is 96% white, and one of the most dangerous cities in Pennsylvania. Let's also remember that small towns with high African American populations exist, such as Fort Washington, Maryland, which is one of the safest communities and most well-off in the country, and is nearly 3/4 black.
So perhaps our legal system isn't going around willy-nilly convicting innocent black people of crimes they didn't commit. Perhaps individuals who happen to be black are making bad choices for which they have to deal with the consequences.
And perhaps as most things in life, it's a little from column A and a little from column B. Your argument is a bit of a straw man, wouldn't you say? Conservatives want easy answers to tough questions, and when a complex answer is given from the left, they boil it down into a straw man that's easier to argue against.
And of course, another thing that's often brought up when it comes to the alleged oppression of non-white people in the US is the fact that African American and Hispanic incomes are much lower than the average white income. Clearly this equals oppression. I mean, come on.
And here comes the just so explanation without trying to dig below the surface, like these types always do. I know looking at the why is hard, but come on.
But again, like the prison statistics, the wage gap statistics would only be indicative of oppression if they were the result of unjust treatment. Black people and Hispanic people on average earning less than white people would in no way mean there's oppression going on if it was just the result of their comparative lack of skills. And when you look at the average education levels of the different races, it seems like this is actually pretty much the case.
And here comes more bullshit racist explanations that don't look at the why. Because obviously, if POC aren't doing well off and aren't as educated on average, it can't be because of issues with urban schools, a system that doesn't foster a good educational environment, and a repeating cycle of poverty because many can't afford college, are passed over when it comes to scholarships, and bullshit like when applying for a job, getting arrested because your kid, less than 4 meters away, is unattended. Nah, it's gotta be that they don't want to. They're just lazy welfare mooches, right? Isn't that where you're headed with this? Even if you're not a race realist, claiming that POC are in poverty by choice isn't much better.
And something that I'd like to mention, which really debunks the idea that non-white people in the US are oppressed, is the fact that there are non-white groups out there who on average do better than their white counterparts in terms of education and finances. And yes, felony charges too.
Oh look, another anti-SJW cliche, the model minority myth.
So under the SJW narrative, would it be safe to say that black people are the most oppressed, then Hispanic people, then white white people and then maybe Asians aren't oppressed at all, or maybe they have special Asian privilege.
Here's a little bit of information to throw a monkey wrench into that. In Vancouver, the Chinese immigrant population has a high rate of poverty, a high crime rate, and education issues not seen in other Chinese immigrant populations. Also, much of the West historically has more of a respect for Chinese, Japanese, and Indian culture than traditional African culture. So that impacted their views on Chinese immigrants, and today of Indian immigrants.
Of course, that's not the case. Look, there are real problems in the black community. There's issues with incarceration, there's issues with drug use, unemployment, poverty, lack of education, fatherlessness. All of those problems are absolutely real, but the thing is, when you make the conversation about oppression and marginalization, it's almost like an abdication of personal responsibility.
And here it is. The "it's your fault, you're poor" rationale. Couldn't be that they can't exactly pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't have any boots to begin with, right?
You're implying that in order to fix this problem, it's the outside world and the system that needs to change instead of your behavior. And look, the system is by no means perfect, but I think as is displayed by the success of Asian Americans, I don't think it's this racist, awful thing that people make it out to be.
150 years ago, you would have been directing this at Irish immigrants. 150 years ago, at Italian immigrants. They only got out from under the boot of racist America by being accepted as white people. White Hispanics are starting to do better because they're being increasingly accepted as white people. This will never happen with most POC. So society's idea of white as the gold standard has to go away for good. Maybe stop having a prejudice against resumes that have names like Jamal, Tyrone, or LaQuisha, because that's another factor.
The United States is a meritocracy, and when we're adults, at least the situations that we find ourselves in are more often than not the result of our own personal decisions.
The US, a meritocracy?
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Having the mentality that the system is out to get you and that it won't let you succeed because it's prejudiced against you is not a recipe for success. This oppression narrative doesn't encourage hard work, it doesn't encourage entrepreneurship.
Hard work equals success is a fallacy that many believe that often turns out to be false. Let's use YouTube as a microcosm of this. You and I both know that there are a lot of amazing channels that stay buried in obscurity for the entire duration of their existence. On the other hand, twats like Logan Paul make it big by being obnoxious douche nozzles. Making it on both the internet and in the real world is more about luck, connections, and a set of privileges that some may or may not have. I know many people hate the P word because they think it's to shame them, but a better way to look at it is the Oregon Trail game. Some people play on easy mode, and others on medium, and others still on hard. Sure, may playing in easy mode will fail, and may playing on hard mode succeed, but let's not pretend it's the same thing.
As we've seen at Evergreen, the only thing it encourages is victimhood. If we want non-white communities to flourish, we need to be teaching people how to succeed in life, not teaching them how to complain about life.
Teach them not to complain about life? Your whole channel is doing exactly that. There's throwing stones while living in glass houses, and then there's throwing stones from within your glass house. You're doing the latter.
It is statistically proven that if you finish high school, wait until you're 21 to get married, then have kids, and work full-time, there is only a 2% chance that you will be in poverty, and there is a 75% chance that you will be in the middle class, and this is true across all races. Success is possible, and it's possible for everybody. We just have to be willing to work for it.
Statistically proven. Nice job with the weasel words. There's quite a lot of unemployed college graduates, and they're not all gender studies or liberal arts majors like you're probably thinking. It's a little higher than 2%. As kids were told, success is possible for everyone. You can be whatever you want to be if you just work hard. While the reality is, 90% of us will be mired in mediocrity working dead-end jobs because they pay the bills, want to strive for something bigger, but afraid to because we might fail. And most of the remaining 10% will go for the glory and fail. Not everyone can be middle or upper class. That's reality.
I'm here to talk about men, or more specifically, Western men. Millennial men. White, Western, millennial men.
Wow, I have to say, I'm impressed. You anti-SJWs aren't even pretending to be egalitarian anymore. Notice how you specified white right off the bat. I know from the title of your video that you're pushing traditionalism, but why only white men? Why not black men, Hispanic men, Asian men, Middle Eastern men, or Native American men? Not even trying to hide the racism anymore, are you?
But don't worry, this is not a bitch fest about how terrible you supposedly are for having a penis between your legs. I know I have the nose ring and the problem glasses. I basically look like an undercover SJW.
I'd point out how that's cisnormative, but I have a feeling it'd be a wasted effort. And what's with the idea so many of you have that there's a certain SJW look? At least half of you right-wing types look as much the stereotype as those on our side do. And there are many on our side who look nothing like the stereotype. I just find it hilarious you try to put people in these boxes and can't even fit yourselves in your own boxes.
But I promise, this is not a dig at you. This is not directed at you if you are red-pilled. It is, however, directed at you if you are one of those males who calls yourself one of these things. Antifa member, any other gender than male or female, feminist, a stay-at-home dad, a crossfitter, someone who places #refugeeswelcome in their Twitter bio, or someone who has partaken in the Women's March. So, first things first, please stop.
So, basically you're marketing your video towards a group of people who know you're an idiot. The only ones who will listen to your alt-right ramblings will be your alt-right fanboys, who already agree with you, so you'll just be preaching to the choir. Funny how you didn't think that one through.
I'm a bit done with seeing almost every single white millennial male where I live look like they have the ability to menstruate. What the fuck is this? Where is your masculinity?
You know, that's quite misandrist of you. I'm sure your nice guy MRA Gamer Dude subscribers really appreciate that you threw them under the bus like that. What do you define as masculine anyway? Working with tools, fixing cars, doing home repair work, physical strength, like being able to deadlift 400 pounds and bench 250? What if a guy is a coal miner who loves fixing classic cars, but also loves poetry and painting his nails?
I guess I'll never know. You're probably wondering though, why am I bitching about this? This doesn't concern me, does it? Usually the best course of action is to just let people be, but no, I'm not gonna let people be with this. No. The problem with letting people be here is it directly harms our society.
Yeah, some kid who wants to play with his dolls instead of football is really hurting a lot of people. In your description, you say stuff about reals over feels. But you seem really butthurt that there are men who don't want to cater to your feels of what makes a real man. And it's kind of hypocritical to push for traditional gender roles when in the past you made a men's rights themed video.
Therefore, making an app based on splitting bills due to race and gender is not only racist and sexist, especially for those who have to pay more due to something that happened at birth and they can't change. It's also extremely rude and ignorant to assume that a certain person who has a certain gender or a certain race cannot earn more because of their race or gender.
So, do you think men should be boxed into the breadwinner role, or that women should pay their fair share on a date? You can't have both, although I know a lot of you wish you could.
And in a wider and more extreme case, it harms our race. The white race.
Wow. Forget the dog whistles, this is a fucking tuba playing. The whole egalitarian shtick from your earlier videos is dropped, and you're now sounding like a racist grandmother, despite most likely being in your early 20s.
But before I actually explain this, I think it might be worth talking about the actual root of this. Women aren't women anymore. Women are acting more like men, and men are acting more like women.
And this hurts you. How?
A LifeSite article directly states that men in fact are giving up on marriage, where fewer young men in the US want to get married than ever. With feminism pushing men out of their traditional roles as breadwinners, protectors and providers, and divorce laws increasingly creating a dangerously precarious financial prospect for the men cut loose from marriage, men are simply no longer finding any benefit in marriage.
You're starting to sound like a MGTOW now. And it's also hypocritical as fuck for you to say this, considering you said in a previous video,
I am right now a woman working in a STEM field.
So, not only are you being a misogynist, misandrist, Archie Bunker bigot, but you're also a hypocritical sack of shit like Lauren Southern, who can't even follow her own example. If you're working in a STEM field, then by your own definition, you're not fitting into the box you want to shove every woman into.
And that's true. Because for the first time in US history, the number of women in the workforce has surpassed the number of men, whilst more women than men are actually acquiring university degrees. Thus, the whole stay-at-home dad thing is becoming more popular.
Oh no! People have choices! How horrible! And you conveniently leave out the fact that many men skip college to go into the military, and many men go into trade schools. Also, there's the fact that men are less likely to want to take on the heavy debt that women are, so dropout rates are higher. The argument that RageAfterStorm is using about how allegedly gynocentric society is reminds me of the kind of stuff that Paul Elam says. So, it kind of proves that men's rights is actually just a push for traditionalism by using social justice language, hence the issues brought up, such as male circumcision, male suicide rates, male homelessness, etc. It's because they know that the old-style Archie Bunker, get back in the kitchen form of misogyny won't fly with anyone under the age of 60, except in very conservative areas.
Because men don't have to become this figure of confidence anymore that was previously necessary.
Are you saying that stay-at-home men can't be confident? Or stay-at-home people? So, stay-at-home mothers can't be figures of confidence? Isn't that the kind of shit you anti-SJWs are always ragging on feminists for allegedly saying?
Okay, so equal rights and all, Dave gets to stay at home whilst Margaret goes out to work and all that. She's paying taxes, she's paying for the family. Why am I moaning about it? Here's the problem. In Warren Farrell's book of Why Men Earn More, he lists 3 specific things about men and their workforce efforts. Number 1, men work longer hours. Number 2, men take more hazardous and riskier jobs. Number 3, men's willingness to train for technical jobs will limit the time with their families. So let's assume we now have a higher proportion of women who are breadwinners. That's great, but now we have a massive gap in the construction work facility.
Where did you conclude that from? Did you ever think that maybe more women are entering the labor forces than ever before? It sounds like you're actually playing both the gynocentric card that red pill types like to play, while advocating for a traditionalist system that keeps men in these risky jobs. You also seem to continue to assume that both parents working is somehow not a reality, although it's become the norm.
In addition to this, women take off more time for maternity, as well as having period pains and all that other shit that women go through. Men don't have these problems. Men don't suddenly get pregnant and then expect the company to train someone in for them. Not only that, but it isn't actually natural for women to work a 9-to-5 job and then only see their kid for 2 hours a day and then maybe a bit more on weekends.
Once again, I'd point out the transphobia in men can't get pregnant, but it's useless, considering this is someone who wants to drag us back to a romanticized version of the 50s that never existed anywhere except on TV. Also, men would take more time off to spend with their kids, attend baseball games, etc., except for the fact that people like you want them to be workaholics. Both parents working allows for parents to do stuff, like go to little Jimmy's baseball game. And why are you only talking about heterosexual couples? Don't gay parents exist in your world? By your logic, what should happen to gay and lesbian couples? Should one work and one stay at home? Should both work in a gay relationship and neither in a lesbian relationship? Or do you want to erase LGBT people altogether? Are you homophobic in addition to being racist and sexist?
Women make better caregivers than men do. It's a fact.
So, you're saying men aren't good caretakers and men aren't nurturing? That moment when a feminist makes a better men's rights activist than an actual anti-feminist.
Psychology Today explains that women have a paternity certainty, whereas men actually don't.
Jesus Christ, this is painful. Remember when even the anti-SJW side admitted that this way of thinking is misogynistic? Now they're spewing that kind of shit that they claim they were against. To put things into perspective regarding my previous statement of how even the anti-SJW side admitted that this way of thinking is misogynistic before they jumped on the Trump train and aligned with the alt-right and evangelical Christians, allow me to play this clip.
If they're so righteous, let them stay at home and teach their children that righteousness.
I'm sure this will surprise you, but not all women have children, you know? And secondly, how do you suppose you would enforce this? What, you want like a Taliban system? Wow, you're a fucking moron.
They have no place on the podium. They got no place in the political sphere. I'm sorry.
Yes, they do. The law says so. Well, apart from your podium shit, but that will probably change too.
You don't know how to debate.
Oh, and you do?
You're ugly. You're a woman. You shouldn't be in politics.
And that's an example of your debating skills, huh?
That's a man's job. This is a man's world.
Everyone should be able to pursue whatever career they want to. How can you not see this?
As much as I hate Undoomed, I unfortunately have to give him credit for calling out this kind of bullshit.
Sure, in a marriage you can assume that your female partner has been monogamous, but you can never actually know. Obviously you can take paternity tests, or if the child has the same messed up nose that you do, then I guess you kind of sort of know that that's your kid. But those things will still never settle your mind, and it's not supposed to. Women don't really have to worry about this. That is one reason to why women are more attached to their children than men are.
A man usually assumes that the child is his. Am I getting some kind of personal insight into why you're pushing this traditionalist mindset?
Men do not have a biological clock that slows down after 30. So when a woman has a kid, or 2 kids, or 3 kids, or 4 kids, or 5 kids, or however many kids she's gonna have, she knows that that stream of children will eventually end.
And sometimes men are shooting blanks, and older men have a harder time getting it up. However, this doesn't mean women should get married at the youngest age possible to maximize the amount of kids they're going to have. I don't know if you noticed, but we don't have a 20% infant mortality rate anymore.
So, does any of this mean that a woman can't be a bread earner at all? No, it doesn't. It just means that all of this information supports my claim as to why women should stay at home and look after the kids, and then the man should go to work.
So, you think women are prone to cheating much more than men are? You sound like Black Pigeon Speaks, who believes that women having sexual freedom and the right to vote is what destroys societies. It's his most viewed video. But at least you're slightly less misogynistic than someone like Angry MGTOW, who thinks all women are not even human beings.
Sure, you get anomalies within what I just mentioned, but I'm talking about an average skew. Along with the lack of pressure that men face these days with being breadwinners, and supporting a whole family with their day's work, men do not really need the confidence in life that they were required to have in the past.
So, a man's confidence should be tied up in how much money he makes? Ladies and gentlemen, this is toxic masculinity. The idea that being a real man means being dominant and bigger and better at everything. And that's related to the incredibly misogynist idea that women exist to be servants to men.
It takes a lot of confidence to know that going out every day, earning money, is going to be enough to put food on the table and put a little bit more extras to it. Along with fixing the car, the broken sink, and teaching Jimmy to play baseball on Friday evenings.
This is a perfect example of how patriarchy hurts men too. A man must change his personality to conform to the idea of being the 1950s father. Not every man wants to be Ward Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver. Some men aren't skilled with those things, but it doesn't make them less of a man. And some women are skilled with those things. Why should people who fall outside that box not allowed to be confident? For a group that loves to chant the mantra of reals over feels, you cling to the sentimental portrait of 1950s America. Biology doesn't determine gender roles. Up until the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of things that both men and women did. On the farms, everybody pitched in to do chores.
In the past, this is what you had to do to be a proper fatherly and husband figure.
Yes, in the past, where you want to drag us back to in your Archie Bunker fantasy land. The idea that you must fit a certain mold to be a real man needs to stay in the fucking past.
Women aren't really required to have confidence, whereas in the past, men were definitely required to have it. Back then, there were no advertisements to tell men to be comfortable in their bodies and comfortable with this and comfortable with that. Back then, that didn't exist, and it still doesn't exist.
Oh no, men feeling good about their bodies! How horrible! I bet if some of this shit was quote mined, posted on Tumblr on a fake feminist blog, some of your buddies, perhaps you yourself, would take the bait and do an angry response to the misandry in the blog. Funny how anti-SJWs complain about men being forced into certain roles, while pushing for it at the same time.
However, there are plenty of advertisements and sources from the media that tell women to be confident with all the insignificant little things that they have. Women are being given the confidence that men very much needed.
And men should be given confidence too, certainly. You're coming so close to actually making a point. Let's see if you actually make your first valid point, or if you run the other way.
Roles are being reversed. Not only that, but women are losing their femininity because of feminism itself. Women are being told that they don't need a man, that they can do this independently, where in actual fact, straight women do need a man.
And she ran the other way with it. She almost, for a split second, saw the problem, but then decided it was because women aren't being docile and submissive that's the problem. Are you saying that men can only be confident if a woman restrains herself? That's kind of misandrist.
Masculine energy is all about breaking free from constraints, overcoming, closing the deal, protecting, providing, leading. All absolutely necessary components for a woman to experience from a man so she feels safe and flourishes in her femininity. and feels like a woman.
Masculine and feminine are arbitrary constructs decided by society. But even so, what about women who naturally have masculine traits, and men who have feminine traits? These aren't new. They've been around as long as people have. The difference is, kids used to be, and still are, bullied for not fitting into these boxes. What if you had a little brother who liked ballet, and the boys in school beat him up every day for being a sissy? The system you want to return to is like that.
Adhering to the feminist roadmap stops that woman from looking for a man that she really wants, and stops her from getting that man too. Telling women to have casual sex, to shave their heads, to be filled with terrible tattoos, use repulsive sexual language, is doing them more harm than good.
Oh no, women actually making choices that aren't all about being objects of desire for men. How horrible! A woman doesn't exist to please men. Women are people too. Also, you're throwing some men under the bus here. Some guys like sexually liberated women with shaved heads and tattoos. Are the guys who find those kind of women to be hot somehow defective in your eyes? Also, I hate to bring a person's appearance into this, but you're being kind of hypocritical. You're saying women should look hyper-feminine, yet you're dressed in modern fashion and you don't act like the outdated version of a refined lady that you seem to be pushing. Of course, I'm not saying you have to look any way you don't want, but you're being a hypocrite.
And this is where you have groups like MGTOW or men going their own way. Men refusing to marry women, men telling other men to not let a woman have their possessions, preventing themselves from staying in long-term relationships. Most of these men have been through horrifying divorces.
Men who blame this on feminism. Do you think lifelong involuntary bachelors didn't exist in the olden days? No, they just didn't have the internet in the 50s to bitch about it. And as for men who have been hurt by bad relationships and messy divorces, what about in the past, men who are trapped in loveless marriages? Men and women being trapped in horrible marriages in the past was a thing. And at least divorce allows people to get out.
So, let's look at your standard third world country. A very low economically developed country that has absence of women's rights, partially or completely, and you still have your gender roles being practiced. Whilst the treatment of women in these societies isn't something to completely celebrate, it certainly is true that the absence of feminism leads to many cultural benefits in the long run.
Didn't you make claims about society improving for women in Western nations like the US in a previous video you made?
Society has changed, but your triggers and you feeling sorry for yourself has not changed. Let me ask you, are women of ethnic minorities who are also American citizens allowed to vote? Yes, they are. And in the USA today, are there laws and regulations put into place that prohibit the discrimination against sex, race, and religion? Yes, there are. But all of this, way in the past, wasn't even the case. So again, society has changed. It's just your crippled views on society haven't.
You kind of destroyed your own argument with that. If anything, it implies a correlation between impoverished nations and an adherence to traditional gender roles, implying that affluence allows people to escape those gender roles. Remember, The Jetsons was just a cartoon.
So most of these women will have children, whilst the men will do whatever they can to work and keep up the household. But it's important to remember that not just third world countries follow this structure. I think a lot of it is about culture as well. For example, you have Spanish and Italian culture still practicing gender roles, but they're still sort of a first world country, right? But they have a different culture to American culture, to German culture, to English culture.
Spain and Italy are becoming more progressive, as are the Eastern European nations, which are less feminist-friendly than Western Europe and the US.
Some cultures adopt feminism a bit more than others. So then, let's look at this migrant crisis. You have a very large amount of third worlders coming into countries like Germany and Sweden and the UK.
And here comes the not-so-subtle racism.
These are the same people who are more fertile, have many children, and practice gender roles. Because you have such a high amount coming into one country, there is a small, maybe even a bigger likelihood that these people will eventually take over the white race.
I guess a traditionalist video wouldn't be complete without some Nazi propaganda.
They can easily overrun the population of Western countries because of the amount of kids they have and because of the lack of kids that we have. This switchy thing of gender roles means that we will have less children. We will have a higher proportion of non-whites in the country that used to be predominantly white. Take London, for example. British white people make up 45% of the London population, a capital city in the UK.
London is not the whole UK. And besides, the whole point of your video was that traditionalism somehow makes us stronger. So then, why aren't you welcoming these refugees? By your logic, they'll make you more affluent. Or is it just because they're brown? Of course that's why.
And this is why the migrant crisis really is a dangerous crisis. We're dying out and it's not good. So instead of telling women that they don't need men to be happy, how about telling them to be proud of who they are, where they come from, and that it's okay to continue the white race? How about removing the narrative that bringing a child into this world is a terrible idea?
Here's a challenge for all you white supremacists. Define white. There are people from places in the Middle East like Iran, Syria, and Lebanon that look indistinguishable from Western European natives. I noticed that none of you can define white in a way that excludes all non-Europeans or without excluding Europeans. White nationalism isn't based on logic. It's based on fear. Fear of change. That the world is changing and you want to blame people of color and Jews. Sorry, but the world can't stagnate into some romanticized version of the past that never existed. Your way of thinking is why fascism arose in the early 20th century. It's coming back thanks to angry white men being fed ideas by fascists.
Do you know who's telling you that? BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, Time Magazine, the same people that told you that there are more than two genders. Because whilst you're deciding whether to buy a Chipotle burrito every day for 97 years or having a child, these people are getting kid after kid after fucking kid. Well done.
You said you used to be an SJW, as in, I'm guessing you were the Tumblr stereotype. So why did you flip so hard to supporting fascism? Is it because being pro-social justice is no longer the in thing with your crowd? Is it because Gamergate made right-wing politics popular? I just have a hard time understanding how someone could flip-flop so fast, from social justice to hating people of color and Jews, from supporting modern feminism to having evangelical Christian views on gender roles. Once fascism becomes no longer popular on YouTube, what are you going to do then? Are you still going to be a fascist, or will you follow the money to the next political trend? This whole mess of a video sums up everything wrong with the modern skeptic community. It's all about pushing the same right-wing ideas it opposed years ago. Do these people really still think they're to the left of George W. Bush? Do they not realize that the skeptic community has moved very far right, and after Gamergate, slowly stopped supporting liberal ideas? What's really scary is how fast she's blown up on YouTube. Until about a month or two ago, I'd never even heard of her. And suddenly, she's closing in on 100,000 subscribers. No wonder Lacey Green is starting to pander to the red pill crowd. There's a lot of money to be made from outrage culture and fear-mongering.
In his renowned dialogue Sophist, Plato refers to a common trend in which philosophers intentionally distort the truth so that it appears accurate unless viewed from the proper angle.
I can already tell which direction you're going with this, and I can't help but notice the irony.
To make his point, Plato gives the example of the Greek statuary, which was crafted larger on the top than on the bottom so that observers on the ground could view it correctly. Of course, if the observers were ever to view it in scale, they would realize that it was distorted.
Sounds like the capitalist system in America, where the top 1% holds a disproportionate amount of wealth. In other words, the ideal capitalist structure of the right.
Liberals are promoting a similar kind of trend today. Many of these liberals have, started to claim that reality is subjective, even going so far as to label gender, species, and biologically masculine and feminine qualities as social constructs.
Well, gender and gender expression are social constructs. Do you really think the cultural traits and interests we've assigned to men and women have any basis in biology? For example, pink and blue used to be reversed in their gender associations back in the 20s and 30s. Pink was a masculine, decided color, and blue was a subdued, feminine color. Before that, boys and girls were dressed in the same type of clothes until a certain age. Pink was for blondes, blue was for brunettes. And species as a social construct? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean to imply that we all promote the idea of otherkin? Otherwise, species classifications can and do change. I know Brittany probably won't watch this series, but I recommend that you, the viewer, watch Aaron Ra's series on biological taxonomy and how it's changed. For example, the classes of vertebrates used to be Mammalia, mammals, aves, birds, Reptilia, reptiles, Pisces, fish, and amphibians. Now, the old Pisces class has been subdivided into many other taxonomic classes, some in separate subphylums, while only the bony fish remain in the same subphylum as reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals. Conversely, birds are now categorized as a clade of the reptile class, being the only living representatives of dinosaurs and all.
Unfortunately for these deluded escapists, reality is not subjective. No matter what you believe, the mere fact that you believe it does not make it true.
You mean like Pizzagate, the conspiracy theory you've been promoting for months that even Alex Jones admitted is a fraud?
On the contrary, the lens through which you are viewing the world is malformed. And, if you ever decide that you want the ability to view the authentic truth, you will need to change your lens. Because the world is never going to collectively accept an alternate reality to accommodate your fantasies.
Very true. White nationalists have this delusional conspiracy theory that the Jews are behind everything they don't like, and that all of the ancient empires like Egypt and India were founded by blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scandinavians. They blame civilizations collapsing on the people having kids with other types of people in the region. Don't believe me? Look up Arthur Kemp's book, March of the Titans. People actually believe this shit.
This will lead to chaos, and in a way, it already has. One such chaotic example is the ever-increasing racist rhetoric being directed at white people. Such slogans as, "No white people allowed," or "All white people are racist," or "The white man is a devil," have gone mainstream and are now circulating the physical and digital networks of Western society. With the rise of the criminal ideology Black Lives Matter, white people as a whole are now being viewed through a malformed lens.
Where have those gone mainstream? With the possible exception of all white people are racist, the others are largely unknown. But I know where you got that one. Milo Stewart was trying to say that we all have a subconscious bias. He wasn't saying you hate black people because of the color of your skin, although you rational skeptics want to believe that's what it's all about. And just like every other anti-SJW, you demonize Black Lives Matter, not even understanding what it's about. The three biggest things they want are a demilitarization of the police force, body cams on officers, and an end to fine quotas which disproportionately target minorities. Of course, you undoubtedly associate BLM with its most radical members, and ascribe that to the whole group. I could name some examples of anti-SJWs being horrible people, but even after a month, it'd just be scratching the surface of the kinds of people who are fans of anti-SJW content creators. Your debunking of BLM's source is Paul Joseph Watson, the same man who believes in the Illuminati and that reptilian space aliens control our government. The same man who thinks Sandy Hook was a hoax. Ah, fuck it, I give up. You believe in Pizzagate. And if you want white people to stop being viewed as bigots, have you ever tried not being bigots? Many of your friends, such as Richard Spencer, Lauren Southern, and Tara McCarthy, aren't helping matters with some of the hateful rhetoric they vomit out.
So, a couple examples of the mounting anti-white rhetoric are of a white teacher who works for Norm North High School in Oklahoma. This teacher was allowed to teach his students that to be white is to be racist. Another example is of a black English teacher who was suspended from Duncanville High School in Texas for posting a tweet ridden with profanities and racist slurs about the police shooting of black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson. She told her white critics to kill themselves. Another example is of a Canadian judge ruling that a person yelling, "I hate white people," and punching a white person wasn't racially motivated, so it wasn't a crime. Another example is the University of Wisconsin-Madison refusing to denounce the fact that one of its students is selling hoodies bearing the phrase, "All white people are racist," in capital letters. Another example is of some students at the University of California, Berkeley, who held a violent protest on campus last Friday, during which they demanded additional segregated spaces of color for non-white students. They refused to let white people pass major traffic areas, and these protests were encouraged by some of the university faculty. For a final example, we've linked in the description a particularly disturbing video which exposes the violent rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, which you should really take the time to watch. Many liberals claim that it's impossible for a black person to be racist against a white person because reverse racism isn't real. In a way, these liberals are correct because there is no such thing as reverse racism. There's just racism. No matter your ethnicity, if you racially discriminate against a person of another ethnicity, or even your own,
you are a racist.
Even if what you say is true, you mentioned a few examples that aren't even what you said they were. I especially love how you disingenuously twisted the Berkeley protest into a call for resegregation. I don't know how many times we have to tell this to you on the right, but black-only spaces are not a return to Jim Crow. Sheesh, these are simple concepts. And if you're going by the oversimplified dictionary definition of racism, then why can't feminists use the dictionary definition of feminism? Ah, that's right. Because one fits your narrative, the other one doesn't. And you and your sister aren't really in a position to condemn racism without being hypocrites. You're white nationalists, and are chummy with neo-Nazis. Brittany writes for the alt-right website. But I know, white hurt feelings are real racism, not unarmed black men being shot by police officers, because racism magically went away with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? Nope, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn.
Many liberals insist that white people need to sit down, shut up, and adopt the role of apologists. These liberals want nothing more than to see white people, collapse at their feet in a bout of guilt for the transgressions of their white ancestors.
You do know what apologists means, right, Brittany? It kind of means the opposite of what you're trying to say. What it means is you want to defend the actions of a group. Isn't that kind of the opposite of what you're saying? In actuality, while from what I've gathered, you and your sister technically aren't neo-Nazis, you are Nazi apologists, defending white nationalism as being a natural reaction to SJWs. Nobody's saying we as white people have to forever apologize for what our ancestors did. But we are saying that it's important to make things right by pushing for change to a better future.
But the fantasy doesn't end there. These liberals also want to see white people pledge to do all in their power to atone for the transgressions of their white ancestors. I mean, a few ways in which white people can atone are expressing shame over their whiteness, or silencing themselves, or even silencing other white people and black people who, speak out against the narrative.
Gotta love how you white nationalists suddenly pretend to care about black people who are on your side, when the truth is, if you got into power, you'd be putting that guy T on a boat to Africa, along with the other black Americans, regardless of how much he kissed your ass. And what's this about doing everything we can to correct the mistakes of our ancestors being a bad thing? Jesus fucking Christ. And this is you toning down the racism to be more palatable to your audience. Even when trying not to appear racist, the pungent stench of hatred still seeps through, with every putrid, rancid utterance you make about how horrible the idea of white people not being racist is.
Firstly, if races were truly required to atone for the transgressions of their ancestors, that would make all races eligible for atonement. If white people were truly required to atone for their white ancestors enslaving black people, then shouldn't North Africans also be required to atone for enslaving 1 to 1.5 million white people during the Barbary slave trade?
And here come the white nationalist apologetics and whataboutisms. Fun fact, the Barbary slave trade was not of the magnitude that the slave trade to the Americas was. And also, the same route was used for trafficking of African slaves as part of the trans-Saharan trade route. So, the enslavement of Europeans was an exception in that long history of the slave trade route. Even so, that doesn't excuse what happened with white Americans capturing Africans and bringing them over as slaves for the cotton industry. And also, the effects of slavery can still be seen to this day. There are even people alive today who are old enough to remember Jim Crow. And there are likely even people who are old enough to have known someone personally who was a slave at one point. We're not that far removed from slavery historically.
Secondly, it is a grave injustice to assert that a person should have to take responsibility for another person's wrongdoings. Unless a person is directly or indirectly culpable for a crime, they should not have to shoulder the blame or the responsibility. With that said, I do find it particularly interesting how, many of these, commands about taking responsibility originate from the very same people who find it perfectly reasonable to cast off the responsibility for a pregnancy and to believe that murdering an innocent child is a perfectly suitable alternative.
Once again, we are not saying that we are personally responsible for what our ancestors did. And there you go with sneaking in anti-abortion propaganda like roaming Millennial would later do in our anti-vegan video. Gotta love how you right-wing reals before feels people suddenly are all about feels when it comes to abortion. Try doing the research on what we are actually saying, or kindly shut the fuck up. Thank you.
Many liberals like to label white people who oppose their narrative as white supremacists.
But why? Why is taking pride in one's own skin color, in one's own heritage, so controversial? Or is it only controversial when a white person does it? No liberal would dare shame a black person for taking pride in their skin color, in their heritage. And this is as it should be.
Notice how there are German heritage festivals, Irish festivals, Italian festivals, Greek festivals, and so on. Nobody's saying you can't be proud of your own heritage. But white is an arbitrary label based on skin color, and white pride is a code word for white supremacism. The reason that blacks relate their cultural pride to their race is because whites stripped them of their cultural heritage, and the only identifier they had was their skin tone. And they built a new culture from being lumped into a single group of people. If you ask a white person about their ancestry, you'll often hear stuff like Scottish, Irish, Polish, Swedish, German, Italian, Spanish, French, and so on. While with black people, they don't know. Outside expensive DNA tests, there's no real way to trace it back, except for more recent immigrants, in which case they identify with their nation of origin.
America as a whole should encourage cultural and nationalistic pride, not try to stomp it out. In case the liberals who advocate for white guilt culture aren't already aware, it is important for you to realize that your plan is no longer working.
Right. We point out that you're racist, so you're going to keep being racist. That'll show us.
And I'm referring to your method of labeling people racists, bigots, misogynists, sexists, for just opposing your opinion.
If you don't want to be labeled a racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobe, anti-Semite, or whatever, then maybe stop being those things. Or at least try. We don't point out bigotry because we like hurting delicate white feelings. We point out bigotry because it actually hurts people who aren't privileged. Bigotry hurts women, LGBT people, people of color, and other marginalized groups in a very real way. Much more real than the hurt feels that white people get.
The truth is that the vast majority of the people who oppose your narrative no longer respond to insults. Why? Because words that are not rooted in fact, in reality, they mean nothing.
These aren't such insults in the sense of, you're an idiot, you're ugly, you're fat, and other such nonsense that your side likes to hurl. These are calling out real behaviors. The fact that you think calling out harmful behaviors is insulting means that maybe you should stop partaking in these harmful behaviors.
For those of you who argue that black people are being killed every day, we agree with you. Black people are being killed every day, and it's a terrible tragedy. But it's important to note that this is largely due to black-on-black crime, which resulted in 6,000 deaths in the year 2015 alone.
Yes, but have you looked into why black-on-black crime is so prevalent? It has to do with poverty, and conditions that keep black people in terrible economic conditions that foster a high crime rate. White-on-white crime is also fairly high in impoverished, predominantly white areas. Also, suburban middle-class blacks commit crimes at a much lower rate than urban blacks in poverty. We see the same trends with every group of people. However, societal prejudices that make it harder for people of color to escape poverty has led to these continued problems.
What's more, 28% of the abortions performed in the United States involved black babies, while black people make up just 12% of the U.S. population. It has been estimated that since 1973, black women have had approximately 16 million abortions.
And if abortions weren't readily available, imagine how many young black women would be forced to raise kids that they aren't prepared for yet. Abortion gives them a way out of this. Racist white people like to perpetuate the myth of black women having tons of kids for welfare money. But this little fact contradicts that narrative.
As for black people being killed by law enforcement officials, it's true that black people are more likely to die at the hands of police. But why is this? Is it because our police as a whole are racist?
Yes. In many cases, it is. It's a straw man to say that we say all deaths are due to racism. But it's foolhardily to deny that racism is a key factor. So many innocent, unarmed black men are gunned down. Trayvon Martin, for instance, was a casualty of racist vigilante policing by Neighborhood Watch. White supremacists spin a narrative of him being a thug, as they do with every black victim, so they can let themselves off the hook, without admitting that racism didn't magically go away in 1964, by the grace of the flying spaghetti monster, because the Civil Rights Act was signed.
No, it's because black people are disproportionately more likely to be involved in violent crime in the United States, which puts them in the line of fire.
Half-truth. Black people are more likely to be victims of violent crime. And also, we must not forget that unarmed black men are shot. Do you even watch the news? No, InfoWars doesn't count. Neither do white supremacist tabloids like VDare, which I'm sure you're a fan of.
What's more, black people are responsible for nearly half the murders committed in this country, which is incredible when you consider that black people make up just 12% of the US population. Yes, black Americans are suffering. Yes, black Americans deserve reparation. But they cannot demand reparation at the expense of people who are innocent to the cause of their misfortune. Reparations are not owed to black people by the average white person. Reparations are owed to black people by the government for implementing the welfare system, for legalizing abortion, for destroying the nuclear family, for implementing a crappy educational system, and for shipping the majority of U.S. jobs offshore.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
Ah, the old liberals are using welfare to enslave black people narrative that the far right has been vomiting out for decades. Guess who benefits more from welfare and food stamps? White people. Once again, if not for abortions, these young black women would be forced to raise kids they can't afford. Would you want that? You did sort of almost make a point when you said the government has screwed over black people historically, especially in education. Guess who makes up a majority of government? White people. Guess who elects those white people? A lot more white people.
We all need to be aware of what is truly at play in our country. We all need to be aware of who the real enemy is. Not each other, but the establishment. The establishment has been planting and fostering false and disparaging narratives for the sole purpose of turning Americans against one another. The establishment is trying to destabilize our country.
If this video came out any date after the election, I probably would have agreed with you that the establishment is trying to destabilize the country. However, this video came out on October 28th, 2016, when Obama was still in office. It's amazing how white supremacists love to compare Obama to Hitler back then, and insisted he was a Muslim born in Kenya, trying to both establish Sharia law and Soviet communism somehow. Suddenly, after 2016, the narrative went from the Nazis were leftists because National Socialism means it was socialism to, maybe the Nazis weren't so bad after all. It was all about shitting on Obama, and anyone who wasn't a straight white male, who dared to be anything other than super loyal to everything the white man stood for. Hell, Obama bent over backwards for many of you, and tried to appease you to the point where he went from a centrist to center-right. His biggest fault was trying to make everybody happy, instead of doing what needs to be done. Don't get me wrong, I loved Obama, but he was too much of an appeaser, especially in his second term. I wish he would have put his foot down more and said no to the Republicans.
To cripple our reliability upon one another, so that we come to rely upon the establishment itself. And so far, their divide and conquer strategy has been succeeding. The establishment has already succeeded in dividing men and women through feminism, blacks and whites through Black Lives Matter, liberals and conservatives through the false narrative they've spun around the presidential election. And for those who are buying into it, you are being manipulated.
I find it rather interesting that you seem to forget quite conveniently that there are many groups of people who are being marginalized, and that kind of division is necessary in order to achieve equality, which may involve dismantling the current system we have, the system you love. In your ideal world, straight white men would be at the top of the pyramid, and everyone else would just fall in line and kiss white man butt. That's the kind of national unity that the far right wants.
You are being distracted. You are being made to believe that racism is flourishing unhindered in our country, when if you truly take the time to examine the statistics, you will find that your anger is built upon a false claim.
Racism no longer exists, you say? In all honesty?
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
The fact that you're a white nationalist and you're friends with neo-Nazis who are coming into the forefront shows you're full of shit.
And, as far as the establishment is concerned, you are nothing more than a useful idiot. And in knowing that you are a useful idiot, the establishment will use you shamelessly. But the moment that you fulfilled your purpose, the moment that the establishment has squeezed all the benefits from you that they possibly can, they'll discard you.
Gee, that sounds like a certain group of people. Could it be your group of people, the alt-right? Have you ever thought you might be a useful idiot for Nazis who will happily discard you like a used napkin once they decide you're no longer useful to them? You'll become an SJW in their eyes for being not racist enough, not sexist enough, not anti-Semitic enough, and so on. Either you're blissfully unaware of what a horrible fascist piece of shit Richard Spencer is, or you're just as much of a disingenuous fascist as he is.
We all need to stand together. No matter our skin color, race, or gender, we all need to rise up as one. And if we can't do that, if we all just continue to go downward on this destructive path of regression, then we're eventually going to get the country that we deserve. It's going to be a country without harmony, a country without unity, and worst of all, a country without freedom.
And she closes it all with a faux hippie notion of, gee, why can't we all just get along? Be peaceful and love each other, which is all horseshit coming from her. She puts on this act of being a sweet little princess, but read through her Twitter feed at some of the awful shit she retweets. She's a big fan of 4chan's poll, which is known for doxing people and attacking their families. And she even retweeted poll bragging about doing this to someone. Although to be fair, of the major players in the alt-right, she's the least horrible. Although that's like winning a contest between different types of poison based on which one will kill you the least painfully. It ultimately doesn't matter whether she's just someone who got brainwashed on propaganda, or if she's the originator of this propaganda. Either way, she's responsible in the spread of white nationalism, and behind the veil of garden-variety Fox News conservatism is something more sinister. The alt-right has learned how to carefully craft its message to not sound like the 14 over 88 crowd. But make no mistake, even if they denounce those people publicly, in private, they're best friends.